You can access the entire episode now on our website, forbiddenknowledge.news, Rokfin, Rumble, and all podcast platforms. Let's get to some of the higher strange aspects of some of this. This is connected to the Nine, which is an incredibly interesting story about supposedly non-human entities that were contacted by these very elite groups. Could you tell us a little bit about these possible connections?
Yeah. Well, let me go over the Nine here right quick.
Yeah.
So they were supposedly these interdimensional beings. They're transcended their physical form. In some accounts, they were said to be, kind of housed within a computer that was on a spaceship called Spectra that was like orbiting across the, around Earth. But the story changed a lot over the years in that regard. Also, they got the name the Nine, the grand need, I believe, of ancient Egypt, the pantheon of gods, because supposedly, they have been appearing to humanity for centuries as manifestations of different deities and all this other kind of stuff. So they were supposedly originally contacted by a guy called Adrena Puharich during a seance in New Year's Eve 1952. And then a couple of months later, they had a second seance where they were again contacted. And this is like the really famous one. I think Peter Levenda called it the seance that changed the world, because besides Puharich, you had a lot of these elite blue blood families there. You have members of the DuPont family, of the Astor family, all this good stuff, the Payne family, I think. So, yeah.
Now, who was organizing these seances? Was there a certain main group behind this?
It was organized by Puharich's Round Table Foundation, which he had set up like around 48 or something like that. And in theory, a lot of the money for that was coming, from these wealthy donors. I think specifically it was the one Astor heir. I can't remember her name off the top of my head. At least, I'll get into some different possibilities for this in a minute, but that was at least one of the theories that was given for this. So Puharich has like this big seance in 53, and this leads to what effectively almost becomes this cult, I think, that's been going around within certain national security circles and later entertainment. By the early 60s, Gene Roddenberry had actually started to become interested in some of these channeling sessions and what have you. And eventually, this is, if you guys don't know, this is the creator of Star Trek, and eventually some of this stuff was incorporated into Star Trek, especially like in the later shows. I mean, there's some thinking that Star Trek DS9, for instance, was totally modeled upon some of these encounters, and there's definitely some, you can see like with the prophets, for instance, in the DS9 world, there's definitely some very clear parallels with the Nine, also with Q. Basically it's these interdimensional beings that exist outside of time and space and all this other kind of stuff. So it was a big thing with the Nine, and Peter Levenda got into this in the Sinister Forces book, the first one, I think, which was also, I believe, the first time this has really been addressed to the public at large. And that was the kind of loose connections that they had to the Kennedy assassination. So one of the guys who helped Puharich channel the Nine and who worked with him for years was a guy called Arthur Young, who had made a fortune by inventing the Bell helicopter, which served as the basis for the Huey. And then he later married another society woman. I can't remember her name now, but he was very good financially, and was able to basically dedicate most of the rest of his life after the 40s to the study of consciousness or something like that. I think he founded the Institute of Consciousness. I can't remember what exactly his thing was called, but he was a really big, early New Age thinker and what have you. He still has, a lot of influence in those circles. So, Young is the stepfather to this guy called Michael Payne, who ends up... Oh, yeah, okay, so that was right. His wife was Ruth Forbes Payne. So she was a member of the Forbes family, and she had married into the Payne family. And then they had divorced, and this was her son, Michael Payne, who, again, Arthur becomes the stepfather to. So anyway, Michael Payne is married to a woman also named Ruth Payne. And fast forward to the 1960s, they befriend a young Marine who had just returned after defecting from the Soviet Union. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald. and they would continue to house him on and off, and especially his wife, throughout the whole period in the early 60s leading up to the Kennedy assassination. It was actually Michael Payne who introduced Lee Harvey Oswald to like the White Russian circles in Dallas, and Marina Oswald, his wife, was actually living with the Paynes at the time of the assassination, and they kind of closely managed her during the whole time period with that. So it's, yeah, it's very interesting in that regard. So the connection that the Nine had to the Kennedy assassination is pretty well known, but the one with the Watergate is almost never talked about. So to get back to Adrena Puharich, Puharich always claimed that he first started doing work for the National Security State in 1947 for what was known as Project Penguin. I have never been able to find a record of anything called Penguin, but the Navy did start Project Pelican in 1947. So, and later when Puharich was brought in to do work on this behavioral modification, because I should point out, Puharich was actually one of the big guys to originally push magic mushrooms and stuff like that too. He was really big into psychedelics, all this other kind of stuff. He was being used by Project Artichoke, not MK Ultra. And Artichoke was very enthusiastic about the work that he was doing, which I'll get to here in a second. But MK Ultra, not so much, and that led to a very strange series of events. Basically, Gottlieb dispatched this guy, John Mulholland, who was a professional stage magician, to investigate the parapsychology work that Puharich was doing at the Armor Research Institute for Project Artichoke. And Mulholland was really close to the Rockefeller family, specifically Nelson. Kind of think he was actually the Rockefeller guy who was put into MK Ultra to keep an eye on how things were going, to see if they were being defrauded or something like that. But anyway, he sets about trying to totally destroy Puharich's reputation after he witnesses his work at Armor and eventually gets him drummed out of the CIA and any support from the CIA. And it's really interesting because years later, like in the 1980s, the Rockefellers were again after Puharich. This was like when Puharich was doing work on, what we would think of now as like zero-point energy. And I think they had threatened him with like a lawsuit or something like that. But he basically had to sign some kind of like waiver for them stating that he would cease all like research on, zero-point. So the Rockefellers really had an axe to grind for some reason with Puharich for like years and years. But the Office of Security loved him. And this brings up a lot of interesting possibilities for this. So like on the one hand, getting back to like the Round Table Foundation that he had set up, some of the backers, one was like Henry Wallace, and there was another guy from Eastern Europe. I can't remember his name, but Henry Wallace was compromised by the occultist Nicholas Roerich on behalf of the KGB. Well, it wasn't called the KGB back then, whatever it was called during like the pre-World War II era. Because he had been in contact with Roerich, and Roerich had turned over all these Dear Guru letters, essentially, that he had written to him, to the Soviets, and they were threatening to expose that, and it led to some political deals. But anyway, Henry Wallace was the vice president under FDR, and this had basically led to him being forced to resign as the vice president. But Wallace was a guy who had been suspected of communist activity, and there were a couple of other guys in Puharich's milieu that were also suspected of this. And this is interesting because the big guy who was running the day-to-day operations for Artichoke was an O&I guy called Morris Allen, who had spent a lot of time in the early 40s, going into the mid-40s, chasing the Reds in New York City for the O&I prior to going, the World War II thing breaking out and going back to like Nazis and fascists. But Allen was like a veteran communist hunter. And another one of Puharich's contacts later was another Office of Naval Intelligence guy called Edwin Byrd, I believe, who had done essentially the same thing during World War II, but in Boston. In fact, Morris Allen and Byrd, I believe, had actually testified about communist subversion at the same Senate hearing at one point.